All right. Well, welcome everyone to this new installment of Another Look. We have a book here that is not, the usual fare insofar as it's not a novel. It is written by a novelist, and I suppose you would call it an essay on aesthetics, Japanese aesthetics. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to what our panelists have to say. They know a lot more about this tradition than I do. And I have to say that, like many people whom I've spoken to have read Tanizaki's Praise of Shadows, I'm really kind of drawn into the fascination of this kind of aesthetic of shadows and darkness, and the notion that our Western, what should I call it, photophilia is one that one rarely gets an occasion to view as something that might have a certain vulgarity to it, and a way in which Greek statues, especially if you think of the way Greek statues used to be painted in primary colors and had all these bright kind of false jewels in the eyes of the gaudy is the word for a certain kind of Western aesthetic from a certain point of view if you're accustomed to the shadows. And I bought a house a little while ago that was built in the 50s by two people who were working at the Hoover Institute, both of whom were experts on Japan. They wanted that house to be built in the Japanese style, and it took me a while to get used to the dimness inside. But once you do get used to that dimness, then there is something about being in houses that are flooded with light that becomes a little bit overwhelming. So I think that this book is an occasion for all of us to enter into a discussion of what Tanizaki is trying to say about. I don't know if he's speaking for Japanese aesthetics in general. I have no idea whether he is idiosyncratic in his myth that this is what the true beauty of Japan consists in, or whether it's really his own personal nostalgia. And that's why I thought it would be very interesting to call together the three panelists who are joining us today to discuss with us the Praise of Shadows that we're going to be devoting tonight's session to. So I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one. We're going to be sitting for the first part in the front row rather than at the table, because each one of them has some slides to project, as you can imagine, for this work. So the first panelist to speak is Ethen Wood. He's an associate director of Stanford's Sustainable Architecture and Engineering program. And for over a decade, he has taught architectural design, studio courses, and co-taught courses on Japanese modern architecture, right? And in addition, he has his own architectural design office in San Francisco. He grew up in San Francisco's Zen Buddhist community in the 80s and spent part of his childhood in a Zen Buddhist monastery in the mountains of Carmel without electricity. And in his words, this was part of a concerted effort by the temple to stay true to the traditions and historic experiences from Japan. So with that very brief bio, you can imagine that Ethen is very well situated to speak to us today about Tanizaki's book. And following Ethen will be Mark Gonnerman. Mark Gonnerman, he attended the Harvard Divinity School, after which he completed a PhD in religious studies here at Stanford with a dissertation on the poet Gary Snyder. And he's been a student of Japanese histories and culture since he first ventured to Kyoto in the mid-1970s. He's conducted field work at home and abroad, traveled the world, and living for 3 years on the Saito Inland Sea. And Mark is very graciously always correcting my pronunciation of words like Bono, YouTube, we're talking, but so that inland sea near Hiroshima in Japan, and you've also been a visiting professor of American literature at the Hunan University in China. So looking forward to hearing Mark's remarks as well. And our third panelist is actually Mark's wife, Meri Mitsuyoshi, who is a longtime kind of devotee of entitled opinions, if I may say so. You've been to almost all of our sessions, I believe. And she has a particular appreciation of Japanese aesthetics that's informed by her study of ritual and intergenerational cultural transmission. Meri worked in Silicon Valley for a while after receiving her degree from UC Berkeley, after which she made a career move and became a psychotherapist, and she works as a therapist here at Stanford and also has her own private practice in Menlo Park. So these are the three panelists who are going to be taking a few minutes each to put out some ideas about In Praise of Shadows, after which we'll open it up to discussion. And so, Ethen, why don't I invite you up here to the lectern, and we'll start with you. Thank you.
All right. Well, hello. I'm really pleased to be here and talking about this book. This is a slightly different context than the way that I usually talk about it, because I speak about it in specific relationship to architecture. And how that seemed relevant today is that I think we could look at Tanizaki's writings as nostalgia, but we could also look at it as a kind of provocation. And I think it's a provocation that's based on what was happening in the built environment. I think there's kind of no other country that I can think of where the essence of the national aesthetic was derived from architecture, from a singular source of architecture. And so to start out, I'm going to contextualize that a little bit, relate that to the writings, and then look forward at the end to how Tanizaki's vision might still be realized. So I think when people start to think about the Japanese aesthetic, many times people will think of a place like Ryoanji. Ryoanji is one of the Zen gardens in Kyoto, famously with its 15 stones and its kind of oil cured clay walls. And even as we start to look at it, it's not pristine, right? It's not Versailles. There's something where we can start to see the importance of the patina of time, and we'll talk about more, in which Tanizaki says the glow of grime. And as we start to think about things, I think it's also important to think that it's an aesthetic built on layers, and that nothing is ever presented solely on its own. And so if we look at these ukiyo-e prints by Hiroshi and Hokusai, we can understand that each color is its own block. And so there would be 12 blocks, sometimes more, to make a single print, and they all have to align. And it's this idea that one thing is layered upon another thing, which is layered upon another thing. And as we start to think about Japanese architecture, and maybe even in Tanizaki's phrasing, we can start to think about traditional tea houses. And here we have one, although in this representation, it's entirely overlit, right? This doesn't relate to how we would experience it. This relates to how it needs to be photographed in order to be published. But the provocation that I talked about is this. Right. So in the context 90 years ago, when Tanizaki is writing this, there's something called the Imperial crown style. Right. And the idea of architects hadn't even come to Japan until after the Meiji Restoration. And Joseph Condor came in 1877, and they were trying to find a language for Japanese architecture, which would start to talk about the strength of the nation, especially in its expansion in Asia. And they settled on this style, which was neoclassical, except it was crowned with tiled roofs, right? And so this is the context in which Tanizaki starts to write the book, right? This is the context in which he started to talk about not necessarily a formalism, but the richness of shadows. And I thought this quote, which I'll spare from reading out loud to you, but I thought this was really important in setting up how everything goes, right? Because in the Japanese buildings, there's a roof. It's roof first, right? The walls are porous. The walls are made of clay. The walls are made of paper. And so the eaves have to hang deep to protect the walls from the driving rain. And so there's this parasol, right, that goes up and starts to shade everything. So, we can start to think about, where are these primal sources of that? So one might be Ise Shrine, which is kind of the holiest of the Shinto shrines. We could look to something like a Minka house, right? This is a traditional farmhouse that we'd see. And as you look at it, it's, 3/4 roof and 1/4 house. And you can start to see the matrix of beams that are inside and the darkness that's starting to happen there, right? And that you can see that this darkness starts to become essential in everyday's life. You can look at Nara, and you can look at the south gate and start to see these cloud brackets for how the roof can extend far beyond what should normally happen with a wooden structure. And here we have a detail of those cloud brackets. Or we could look at Kiyomizudera, which is kind of situated half on a hill, half off a hill on this matrix of giant logs. And we can see that it's just roof and the ground plane. And that's the context for where this is happening. And then you can start to see the darkness kind of seeping in within there. And so then on a personal note, when I was younger, and as Robert mentioned, living in a Buddhist monastery as a child, I was confounded by the cross messages of gold. We were in a tradition where we were kind of giving up our attachment to material possessions, and yet we're seeing statuary that was covered in gold. And it didn't make sense to me. And then in kind of Tanizaki really started to catalyze that, right, as gold being a non-tarnishing reflector, right? The gold's preciousness was not about what it represented, but how it reflected the light. So you can see the gilding in this screen painting, and imagine that in very dim light, it would have an ethereal glow that starts to come with it. And the main experience that I had was at Sanju Sangendo, which is a temple in Kyoto where there's over 1,000 life-size, hyper-realistic Buddhist statues, and they're all gilded. And it means 33 bays. And the way that you enter this temple is you enter from the back, and there's these kind of bleachers with these statues. And then you turn and you look down the length of this entire way, and you see 1,000 glowing figures by candlelight. And it was mind-blowing. And it was spiritual. And all of a sudden, I could see the power of gold, but the power of gold only works in darkness, right? Otherwise, it's gaudy. And the archetype for all Japanese architecture around the time of Tanizaki is argued is kind of the rediscovery of Katsura Imperial Villa. Katsura Imperial Villa had been kind of forgotten for many years. And as the imperial crown style was beginning to happen, some Japanese architects were saying, well, maybe we should start to look back at a source. Maybe we should start to see what we were doing and use that as a foil to this kind of westernization. And so as we look at this architecture, what I want you guys to notice is that we have the deep eaves, we have the paper screens. Behind the paper screens is the engawa, it's the circulation path. And behind that is another set of shoji screens. And then behind that will be a matrix of movable screens, right? So there's never this point where direct light comes beaming in, right? It's always filtered. It's always mitigated through layers. And so here we have the interior view, and you can start to see how many layers are coming on the inside, right? You can see the shoji panel on the far left, and then you can start to see these various other panels that are movable. Where this started to become interesting was then around the same time Tanizaki was writing this, or shortly thereafter, Walter Gropius was fleeing Europe and came to Japan and saw this, and he saw this as the epitome of modernization, of modular construction, of mobile pieces that could move in or out and could be adapted to people, right? But it's 1,000 years old. And then we have a moment like at the moon viewing platform here, where we have all the screens separated and that we're looking at floor and we're feeling the weight of the roof, and we're having this diffused ring of light that comes around and frames the borrowed landscape of the garden beyond. And then on Katsura, within the garden, there's a series of other tea houses. And as Tanizaki starts to talk about tea houses and starts to talk about light, I think it's important to remember the texture and the materiality, right? Everything is earthen in hue. We have tatami mat, we have the sand walls, we have reeds. We can start to see the light coming through. Even the way that Tanizaki talks about the kind of reverence of the afternoon glow, that's not just him being poetic. That's the actual sun angle, right? That only the morning and the afternoon sun is low enough to come below a deep eave. So the only time that they would ever get sunlight within the house is in the early morning or in the afternoon. And then the kind of ochre color of the sand enhances the nuances of that golden glow. And here we can see yet another tea room. And in black and white, we can start to feel the mystery of the shadows, right? We can start to see what's lost in the ceiling. We can start to see the layers of the panels as they go back into space, and how they can diffuse the light and be present in the situation. And I kind of am framing this here to remember that all art was created in this context, right? Painting was done in this context. Pottery was done in this context. Poetry was written in this context, right? This is the framework that diffuses all of the arts of Japan. And so lest we think this is simply nostalgia about Tanizaki talking about, oh, how much better things were back then, which may be true. But as I said, I think this is also provocation. I've thrown in a few examples of things that I think have been built within the past 30 years that really embody this idea, but look very different. So this is a house by Tadao Ando. It was done in 1979. It's about 4 meters wide. And although made of concrete, and one might say this has nothing to do with In Praise of Shadows, why I put this one in there is that Ando put the bathroom on the other side of the bridge, and he took great glee in making his clients have to leave the warmth of the house, cross a bridge outside to go to use the bathroom on the other side, right? And I thought that Tanizaki would appreciate that, right? That they had to have an umbrella to use the bathroom, and that he was, even in the modern context of the city, trying to get connections to that primal condition. This is the Wooden Bridge Museum by Kengo Kuma. And it is made of glue laminated timber. But you can see, from the example at Nara, this idea of corbelling out or cantilevering these beams on top of each other. And that when you stack more than one, and you have clusters and clusters of them, how rich and dense the space gets between them, that you look into them and you can get lost, right? What could have easily been done with a single steel beam acquires this kind of marvelous proportions when it's repeated at this kind of density. Also by Kengo Kuma, this is the Prosto Museum. This is actually a museum dedicated to dentistry. But the columns are all 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, and there's thousands of them. And the glass is sandwiched somewhere in between there. And so short of having a shoji screen, having these thousands of cloud-like columns bouncing the light around and the warmth coming through evokes a spirit, which I think that Tanizaki would approve of. This is a project in Sendai by the architect Hitoshi Abe, and it's a perforated steel screen of the dappled light of trees, but you never can see it in its totality. You can only see it in the darkness and this kind of little bits of light peppering through the space. So although it's electric light, it's done in a way with a kind of delicate restraint. This is the Kushino House by Tadao Ando again. And in this case, I think he's much more direct with shadow, where there is a 1.5 foot skylight that allows light to come in and wash the wall, and you see the shadow of the beam cross the surface of the wall. And as time passes, it begins to march and move, and the whole space is activated by a shadow. And then I was taken by this last statement by Tanizaki within the book, right? In the mansion of called literature, I would have the eaves deep and the walls dark. I would push back into the shadows, the things that come forward too clearly. I would strip away the useless decoration. And I thought, what could that be now? And so I thought I would end with this image of the water cherry house by Kengo Kuma. There's 2 slides here. One on the left is a living space. You can see all the windows are pulled on. You have the deep eaves now with steel rather than with wood, but you still get that darkness, that mystery in the ceiling. And then on the right, you see the bathroom entirely of wood, as Tanizaki would have liked it, free from extraneous decoration and framing nature. And so I would there.
Good evening, everyone. Introduce you to Tanizaki. I'm interested in the lives of artists. Talk a little bit about his literary career around the time of this essay. And then, like Ethen, and thank you for that, Ethen, it was very nostalgic for me to see those places. Like Ethen, talk about an artist who's in the lineage of Tanizaki. One of the things that we say in Japanese when someone asks you how you are or congratulates you is okage-sama de, which means thanks to your honorable shadow, right? Congratulations, okage-sama de, thanks to your honorable shadow. And I have a slide about that because I think it's a very important aspect of Tanizaki. It's the yin character is the second character in okage-sama de. And you know the yin yang polarity, complementarity. And the title of his text is Inne Rai-san, in praise of shadow, nuance, subtlety. And I think one of the important things that's going on in this book, in this essay we'll talk about, is Tanizaki feels his society is out of balance and wants to return to an emphasis on the yin side. Now, this slide is one of the saddest photographs to me that I've ever seen. When I first came across this, I just couldn't believe how sad it is. And this photograph represents the end of the Tokugawa era and the turn to the Meiji Restoration. The castle was damaged in the Boshin Civil War because those who were on the side of restoring the emperor had armaments from the West, and they could just lob bombs for a month at this castle and leave it in this state. The Aizu Wakamatsu clan, actually, the Wakamatsu portion of it, came to California and were the first immigrant group from Japan to settle in California and sell tea. Next slide. The Meiji Restoration was about putting the emperor back in charge. And I put here that kanji for sun and moon is a little messed up. You can see it on the upper left. The whole idea was that the era would be of bright, enlightened government. And so there's a certain brightness in the language. There's a certain sense of having a new world, one that's illuminated by new thought, new ideas, and new adventures. And I put here these era names because when you're reading Japanese literature, you'll encounter them, and you'll see that we have the name based on who is the emperor. And Tanizaki lived from the 19th year of Meiji until the 40th year of Showa under Emperor Hirohito. We are now in the Reiwa period. And you can see how the names work. There are a lot of calendrical things going on when one encounters Japan and Japanese literature. Next, please. So Tanizaki was very precocious. He was always #1 in his class. And here's a picture of him with his headmaster at his high school in Tokyo, Inazo Nitobe. And from this time, Tanizaki goes to Tokyo Imperial University, and he's under the influence, as everyone is, by this book, Bushido, the Soul of Japan, by Nitobe, who wrote it in Monterey, California, in English in 1899, and was actually afraid of having it translated into Japanese because he knew he was making a lot of stuff up. And when it was translated into Japanese, it became an inspiration for the young men to join in the work of colonization. Next slide. And Nitobe even came to Stanford, and there he is sitting next to David Starr Jordan with David Starr Jordan's wife and his American wife. Nitobe studied at Johns Hopkins, met his wife, and would go back and forth. And here he is on a lecture tour to American universities to talk about peace with Asia. And when you read the essay or the speech that he was giving, you can tell that war is coming. And you can notice that he is a professor of colonization, which is not how to undo colonization, but how to do it. And that's what was going on in Tokyo Imperial University. Next. Now, Tanizaki never liked business people. His father was a business person, a merchant. He never liked the military. And what was going on at the university bothered him enough that he left it. And he was able to start making his way as a writer. He had some success with this particular story called The Tattooer that went viral as it hit the new newspapers and the journals. And there was an increasingly literate population that was there to receive whatever he had written. And he was starting to understand his talent and the power that came with it. Next slide, please. That particular story had a lot to do with the power of art. and how art could empower women, especially. He goes to Yokohama, and he settles in the Western district, lives in the Western house, and enjoys meeting Western women and working on screenplays and the new cinema. Next. But then the most important event really in his life as an artist was the great Tokyo earthquake, the Kanto earthquake of 1923, where 100,000 people died, mostly from the fire or drowning and trying to escape from the fire. His house in Yokohama was destroyed. And so he moved, next slide, to the Kansai region. You have two main regions in Japan, Kanto around Tokyo and Kansai around Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe. And there, after living a bohemian life, reading Edgar Allan Poe, translating the prose poems of Baudelaire, he moves to Kobe and rediscovers Japan. Next slide. This book, some prefer Nettles, which means to each his own. It's an odd title both in Japanese and in English. To each his own is where he starts to grapple with the difference between the old Japan and the new, and his relationship to each of them. And if you read this novel, which is a very good read, translated by Seidensticker, who also translated part of our essay tonight, you'll see that parts of what he puts in this novel, he pulls into the essay. For these are the ideas that are really preoccupying him at this time. What is the relation of old Japan to the bright light Japan of the Meiji Restoration? Next. So here's the essay, and here's Tanizaki looking very much at home in the old Japan. And I say very much at home. He was famous for moving about 40 times during his life, designing one of his own houses, but also finding ever better places to live, or having to deal through unfortunate circumstances with packing up and moving to another location. Next slide. And at the same time, this portrait of Shunkin he wrote around also 1933 is about a blind music teacher who has a student who blinds himself so that he and his teacher can live together in darkness. And Tanizaki at this time was just very fascinated by this notion of living in darkness. Next slide. And this was a dark time in Japan. Retrospectively, historians look back and call it the era of the Dark Valley, 1930-1945. This professor of colonization and his military friends throughout the government had a plan called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And you can see the extent of it at its height, going throughout Asia, managing the empire, sacrificing the young, and overextending what Japan was capable of maintaining. And people were suffering all over the place throughout this time. And Tanizaki was very much aware of that. Next. One thing that has really struck me in thinking about In Praise of Shadows and the yin energy that Tanizaki would like to pull back into the culture is the shift that happened when in 1873, the government decreed that they would move from a lunar to a solar calendar. Next slide. Plato said that in the Republic, when you change the music, the walls of the city shake. I think that when you change the calendar, the walls of the city fell down. And this is what happened in Japan. If you're on a lunar calendar, you have a real sense of the ongoing change of seasons, moving into the dark, moving back into the light. And the most sacred time of the year, the winter solstice, is the darkest. Next slide. Meiji was all about the sun and Amaterasu Omikami. Ethen showed a slide of the Ise shrine, which enshrined Amaterasu, who was the sun goddess from whom the emperor, who is a god, has descended. And there was a whole state apparatus for maintaining this, a state Shinto religion. And everyone had to fall in line. And Tanizaki was well aware that he was being watched, as were all intellectuals, by government censors. Next slide. So if you look at the different values of yin and yang, and you consider that Tanizaki was advocating for yin in a very yang time, you can see how it plays out with the dark, wet, hidden, yielding side where there's an appreciation for the vague versus the clear and the distinct. Next slide. And here we are, wartime, yang energy, Japan. Next. Where everyone gets on the clock. And really the shift from lunar to solar was to get everyone into the process of participating in industrialization, militarization, electrification, all of the things that come with a new industrial society. And here we are on the clock, and I'm very much aware of it because I'm living in a valley where everyone knows we have a time famine. Next slide. So the text, some people have remarked that it's very meandering. It jumps around a lot. That's a style, it's a genre called zuihitsu, which means follow the brush, where the writer, as he or she is writing, because the first example of this is Sei Shonagon's Pillow Book in the early 11th century, is that the writer writes to discover what he or she has on his or her mind. And this is what Tanizaki is enjoying as he writes this. And this text gets buried in a little collection, two collections of such essays. And we can talk in the discussion about how unusual it is that we have this text here now to read and think about. Now, I want to point out, I want to make one remark. If you reread the text to think about, the Seidensticker translates the word cha-jin, which I've circled in green, as solitary eccentric. And that's an interesting choice because it really means a tea master or an aesthete. Next slide. And I really think one of the things that's going on when you reread the book, look for this, is that Tanizaki is advocating for living life as an aesthete, as someone removed from society who appreciates the beautiful pleasures and the simple things in life and is able, like the tea master, to create beautiful experiences for others. Next slide. Now, this is just one example, and you've seen them in the text, of Tanizaki advocating for a life where one often slips into a dream, reverie, trance, meditation. And there's so many things in the text about entering into a state of meditation where in the final part, one might lose all consciousness of the passage of time. When untold years might pass, and upon emerging, you should find you had grown old and gray. And Tanizaki is very much an advocate for entering into this kind of meditative state, for withdrawing into the quiet of the yin world. Next slide. Now, there's an artist, I think, who's very much in this lineage, in fact, self-consciously so, and that's Hiroshi Sugimoto, who has done a series of these theater photographs. Next slide. And he mentions in a lot of his notes about Sugimoto, there he mentions the text, that Sugimoto is not advocating for a return to the Dark Ages, but asks us to consider how we as modern people became so eager to drown out shadows with light. We have made life easy for ourselves, but what have we lost in turn? he asks. Next slide. Here is another one of the theater pieces, and the next one. And you'll recognize the Stanford Theater here. And what Sugimoto does is he goes into the theater, the movie is running, and he opens the shutter for the amount of time that the movie is projected on the screen, and ends up with a print showing the interiors of these old theaters. Next slide. Including a new series of abandoned old theaters, such as this, where he went in and had to bring his own projector, had to bring his own power source, put Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from Walt Disney, 1927, I think it was, onto the screen, and got this shot in praise of shadows before the police arrived and arrested him for breaking and entering. The man is a legend. And I can only imagine the conversation at the police department in Gary, Indiana, trying to understand what on earth this Japanese artist was doing in this abandoned theater. Next slide. Sugimoto is in this. I have a quote here where he talks about the. I want to read this because I know the point of this is in Praise of Shadows, Tanizaki talks about what if we Japanese had been able to just develop our own technologies, our own arts, continue on the trajectory we've been on for 1,000 years. What would have happened? And one of the reasons I also see Sugimoto as his heir is that he has invented technologies that allow him to express photographically his own aesthetic sensibilities. So he has little motors that allow the developing tray to move in just a certain way in order to be able to present an even image of these seascapes that he makes to remind us that this view that we see here, or when we look out to sea, is a view that people have always seen. It hasn't changed. Next slide. And here's just a very nice image, I think. Next slide. Whoops. Well, there is Bob Dylan's Shadow Kingdom, which is also in the tradition, but that's another story. Next one. So I'll say Okage-sama de and end with 2 slides, because one of the things that In Praise of Shadows does, I think, as any good work will, is change our perceptions. I actually came to the conclusion with this text this time around that really what Tanizaki is doing is advocating for peace in a time of war, and doing it very subtly in a way that will not upset the censors. And I think that works. And I think that was really what mattered to him. And that's why he advocates for living the very kind of life that he lived, stepping back, observing, enjoying, communicating, and reaping the benefits of his life in relation to beauty. So I look forward to more discussion once we sit down. Thank you.
Well, Bob is loading the slides. I want to thank Ethen and Mark for immersing us in Japan, past, present, and what is timeless. When Robert spoke to me about joining the panel for tonight's conversation, I pointed out that unlike the discussants at each of the 30 or so Another Look meetings I've attended, I think that's almost as many as the number of Grateful Dead shows I've been to. I'm neither a scholar nor a writer. Rather, I'm a psychotherapist and a sansei, which is the term for third-generation Japanese Americans. My words are a personal reflection from the perspective of one whose grandparents were born in the Meiji period and immigrated to the US in the early 20th century, leaving rural villages where, as Tanizaki wrote, the feel of Japan still existed. So here is a photo of my grandparents. born in the Meiji period, along with my mother and aunts. This was taken in Redwood City a few years after In Praise of Shadows was published. And after my initial reading of this essay, I was struck by the fact that the setting, a backdrop of nature rather than studio, resulted in shadow and light, natural light. Considering the influence of my grandparents' generation, the Issei, I thought of Mas Kodani, the emeritus reverend at Senshin Buddhist Temple, a Jodo Shinshu temple in south central Los Angeles. In the late 20th century, the 1980s to be more precise, Reverend Kodani arranged a trip to Japan for Senshin youth. Their initial accommodations were not in a hotel, but 2 large tatami rooms in a temple, and they were to fend for themselves buying groceries, general supplies, omiyage, gifts to bring home, and laundry services from the local shop owners. These shop owners later marveled to Reverend Kodani that when they interacted with the young sansei, it was as if they were speaking with themselves before the war, World War II, that is. For context, due to anti-immigration acts and legislation in 1907 and 1924, immigration from Japan was limited and then, as was the case with all of Asia, barred completely. This may have created, at least temporarily, a cultural time capsule in the Japanese American community. Tanizaki describes the destructive impact of Western technology on Japan, and yet the descendants of Japanese who left Meiji period villages, descendants who were reared in the West, seem to retain a sensibility that was recognizable to residents of Kyoto a half-century later. Now, what does this mean? Amida, the Buddha of infinite light, it's pictured here, is a central figure of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, which is described by some as peasant or immigrant Buddhism. It's also the Buddhism that my grandparents practiced. This photo is of the altar that once stood in a corner of my grandparents' dining room, one of 3 light-filled rooms facing the central garden. The garden was accessible from each of the 3 through sliding glass doors bordered by floor to nearly ceiling height windows. Was this choice an abandonment of Japanese aesthetics? Tanizaki writes, there are no doubt all sorts of reasons, climate, building materials, for the deep Japanese eaves. The quality that we call beauty, however, just always grows from the realities of life, and our ancestors, forced to live in dark rooms, came to discover beauty in the shadows, ultimately to guide shadows toward beauty's ends. When the realities of life, environment, climate, nature's soundscapes and vistas are those of California rather than Wakayama, where does one discover beauty? After an initial, at times jarring, first reading of the essay, darkness and shadow became, for me, figurative as well as literal. I see Tanizaki's appreciation of darkness as reflective of a capacity for truly seeing. Tanizaki also states that the unseen does not exist. This is true if one engages with the world in a state of attentiveness and openness. And in light of Tanizaki's reference to Japanese cuisine giving rise to silent music, is Tanizaki also arguing for a way of listening? Perhaps connecting with the life realities of Japan also gave rise to an architecture of the mind and heart that was carried across the Pacific with Japanese immigrants. There is another quote from the essay which resonates with the immigrant experience. We seek our satisfactions in whatever surroundings we happen to find ourselves, to content ourselves with things as they are. We resign ourselves to the inevitable. If light is scarce, then light is scarce. We will immerse ourselves in the darkness and there discover its own particular beauty. To be with things as they are. This is the camp where Japanese Americans, including American citizens from the East Bay, San Francisco, and the Peninsula, were incarcerated during World War II. Among them were my maternal and paternal grandparents, my parents, aunts, and uncles. For them, the life realities became those of the Utah desert. This is Chihiro Obata, who was born a year before Tanizaki and immigrated to the US in 1903. He was invited to join the art faculty at Berkeley, but was forced to leave his home for the Tanforan Assembly Center. It was then a racetrack and is now a shopping center off Highway 92. And then the Topaz Camp in 1942. He continued to paint and wrote that what he created at Tanforan and Topaz was, in his words, my way of showing my gratitude to nature. He also shared, if I hadn't gone to that kind of place, I wouldn't have realized the beauty that exists in that enormous bleakness. And the image on the very first slide was one of the Topaz paintings of Obata. Obata captured scenes from camp in sketches as well, and here is one of a barrack. In a later interview, he shared that families gardened about their dwellings in order to beautify them. Everything had to be brought in from the mountains, rocks, trees, and shrubs. 2 years ago this month, my mother returned to Topaz with her sisters for the first time since leaving in 1945. Here they are again, the same sisters you saw in the first photo, although many decades later. Not much remains save foundation fragments and an expanse of desert, with Topaz Mountain, for which the camp was named, in the distance. Docents from the local museum guided us to the actual site of the family barrack, where we found signs of my grandparents' attempts to find the beauty that exists in bleakness. I imagined my grandparents repeatedly returning from walks with 1 or 2 stones, gradually building the perimeter, planting the tree. It was a practice of seeing, being immersed in the experience to be fully present, acknowledging both shadow and light, a practice of care. One present-day equivalent of the glaring electric light is the screen, primarily on our phones. It pulls us away from truly seeing and listening. After rereading and reflecting, I think of In Praise of Shadows not as a refutation of the West, but of the unquestioning acceptance of, or maybe succumbing to, the allure of carefree convenience. The efficiency granted to us by 21st century technology also blinds us to fully inhabiting our reality by creating one that adheres to and reinforces a narrow self, or perhaps AI, perpetuated ideal. Oh, no, there's another one. Returning to Amida, the Buddha of infinite light, Shinran Shonin, its founder, captures what Tanizaki mourns is lost. Delicate sounds of the jeweled forest trees, natural music, serene and consonant, unexcelled in pathos, subtlety, and elegance, take refuge in the pure music. Pure music can be defined as the capacity to sit with the unknown without slipping into habit or judging what should be. Rather, it is openness to the fullness of what exists. This final image is a painting that hung in my grandparents' home. Chihiro Obata started an art school at Topaz, and my grandfather painted this in one of Obata's classes. It was not displayed in one of the sun-filled rooms I mentioned earlier, and I realize now that was in some ways fitting. I did not understand what the painting represented until my first pilgrimage to the site of the Topaz camp 4 decades ago, and when I gazed at the landscape and recognized the mountain that was present throughout my childhood. As a psychotherapist, it is essential to listen for what is unspoken, to look toward the shadows. Taking refuge in the pure music referenced earlier can help create space for acknowledging and working through what may be hidden or feared, and thus bring about meaning. Tanizaki closed his essay with the hope for somewhere in literature or the arts where something could be saved. That somewhere may be within us.
The West seems to come across as a little bit too much obsessed with the light, and I've been thinking of how much of Western art, or periods of Western art, in photography above all, and also cinema, where darkness is really the main element for, yeah, that, you go from an age of enlightenment, you go into the epoch of romanticism, and you find that all of a sudden now there's an emphasis on the dark, and that even the practice of art restoration in the Enlightenment age, they would brighten the canvases, and in the 19th century with Romanticism, they would darken them. And I just want to make one or two general remarks about our experiential relation to darkness, because we live, most of us, certainly here in California, deprived of the darkness of night, because of excessive lighting at nighttime and light pollution. I gather that all around the world, there's been a general disappearance of fireflies, which were a very common sight in many places until a few decades ago. And it's because there's just not enough darkness for them to engage in their mating rituals with the dances that take place, at nighttime, that they have to be synchronized and so forth. So there's a sense of what do we lose, really, in our own, existential relation to the diurnal, nocturnal rhythms each day and seasonally and yearly as well as what kind of relation to a primal kind of origin, which is an origin that is really in darkness. I'm astonished to think of the Big Bang, that for the first 375,000 years, it was a completely dark event, because electrons were not able to, travel freely until the ionization period. So can you imagine all of creation, where we imagine this huge sort of explosion of a burst of light and so forth, but to imagine that it all kind of took place in a kind of dark moment of cosmogenesis is really quite astonishing. So I think that there's ways in which art that engages in this kind of shadow play is drawing us back, to something that we all feel, I think, primordially, within ourselves as having some kind of primacy over light in that sense. So I have a question for anyone, all of you, and I think, Meri, you're the only one who mentioned that at a certain point, Tanizaki speaks about that he doesn't believe in the unseen, that there is nothing as the unseen. He speaks, this was rather shocking to me, when he says that the unseen for us really doesn't matter, or it doesn't exist, and that we only see what is given, and therefore we make as if the unseen is non-existent. But it seems to me that everything that this essay is suggesting is that the point of shadows is that they are the place of concealment for the unseen, and that there's a privative presence of things in the shadows, which maybe don't come into the realm of visibility, but which have a presence, a kind of latent presence within the architectural space and within the psychic space as well. So that's the one part of this essay where I was having a hard time trying to figure out what he could possibly mean by this repudiation of the unseen. So, anyone? Here, take this.
Well, I agree. That was my initial response as well, because if, as I alluded to at the end, so much of the inner work is really searching for what is hidden. I in trying to work through and what I was writing this time, I began to look at it as interpreting him as saying that if we do approach and appreciate that there is a presence there, in a sense, it's not, the unseen is not non-existent, because we know that there is a presence, even if it's not readily apparent.
I don't know, as I was reading the text and thinking about how he's phrasing the shadows and the unseen, to me, it's almost, it is dichotomy. We were talking earlier about how Japanese aesthetic is often two dichotomies at the same time, and that the unseen is both not there, but it's also pregnant with possibility, right? It's the shadows created in the tokonoma and the ritual niche are there to reveal the layers of shadows that are there, and so it's kind of both absence and possibility simultaneously.
Yeah, no, because in my Japanese-inspired architectural house, there are all these cupboards and cabinets and things, because, and I was told, well, yeah, in Japan, there's this premium on putting as much stuff away from the space so that it doesn't appear, and that what appears is just as, a certain kind of emptiness. But that the unseen is there, but it's unseen, but it kind of is there. So Mark, I really like the way you did this Tanizaki, follow the brush or whatever the thing is. Yeah, you were embroidering a great many things in your thing. So would you say that Tanizaki is all about the yin, and because as he also suggests, and those of us who have any even kind of cliched notion of a city like Tokyo, it is all glitter and lights and westernized and yang. Is that really the essence of this duality in the Japanese aesthetic?
Well, I think what comes to mind is that for Tanizaki, it was a big shift to go from the yang of Tokyo to the yin of the Kansai area region. And what he's doing, I think, is he's looking at a society that's just gone way over to one side, and is reminding people of things that are fast being forgotten and exchanged for the sake of convenience. That is, there's that part where he says, if it's cold and there's a heater, you'll go to the heater no matter how ugly it is, right? And so I think what he's meditating on is how culture change and colonization happens without people really being aware of how changes in technology, changes that make life easier, are a matter of gain in some ways, but also always a matter of loss. I mean, part of living in Japan seasonally is that you're cold in the winter, and you adjust in age-old ways of adding more clothing and sitting around the kotatsu, and the space is in your slides, Ethen, indoor, outdoor. There's very little distinction, and you feel the seasons, and it's hot in the summer, incredibly hot and humid, and you want that ugly fan there. Tanizaki doesn't, right? So he's trying to make visible or conscious changes that are happening, that are colonizing changes, the way I think we're being colonized right now by, say, the imposition of artificial intelligence. When I do a search online for something now, artificial intelligence is there to ask me if I wanted to be involved. And I don't. And even when I do a search to find out how to turn it off, it's there asking me. Or what Mary was saying about the phone. And, you know, we adopt it, but we don't really consciously think about the consequences of that behavior. And we're not, you know, so this is what Tanizaki, I think, is getting at.
Yeah, well, you know, my colleague Jun'ichirō said the first country to be Americanized was America itself. So in that sense, yeah, there's a colonization by forces of technology, there's colonization by forces of capitalism and modernization. It's really a kind of universal global destiny that these things against forces against which we're mostly powerless infiltrate every aspect of not only the private sphere, but also the public sphere and the political sphere. So it's, yeah, in that sense, this is a book very much about a kind of impossible past that he was well aware of too. So I think we're going to open it up to all of you and see if you have questions. Yeah. Do we have mics, or should I just pass? Yeah.
And our Zoom audience can send questions in on the Q&A line here.
Okay.
And we will also be able to answer from your homes.
All right. Well, why don't we take a few live ones? Do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Sure. Share your microphone.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to, it just occurs to me there's some parallels in Western civilization with what he was thinking. St. John the Cross writes his poem, The Dark Night of the Soul, about going out into the darkness to look for his beloved with no light except the light in his heart. And I was thinking, oftentimes in Europe, you see both eating places and churches where they are in darkness. And I think that darkness is valued for socializing and for prayer. Likewise, you mentioned snow. St. Bernard of Clairvaux would go out into the snow and kneel in the snow and pray there. I don't know quite how that works, but and the final one that occurs to me, there's a Vincent van Gogh painting called The Night Cafe. Rather famous. It's a pool hall with a bar, and the proprietor is very garishly lit. And it's completely lit. It's very brightly lit, garish colors, and nobody looks happy there. Most of the people are slumped over in their tables, and it seems like these were sort of like fellow travelers or kindred souls of I'm sorry, I forget his name. Kind of at the same time or before he was there, they perhaps saw some of these things also. It's kind of like this sense I kind of feel he was encountering Western civilization without the civilization. Thanks.
Yeah, we were talking about that before, before the panel started, about the way in which there was a big change took place in Western civilization when you go from pagan antiquity to the Christian era. The Christian church is interior. And if you go to Rome today, all the public piazzas, and you look at what ancient Rome was all outdoors. I mean, the public sphere is all outdoors. And then all you have to do is just very literally, you step into one of the churches and all of a sudden you're in the dark. It's very dark. And you have the kind of glitter, shadows and subtlety and nuances inside that space. The Greek Orthodox churches also, with their icons and the gold mosaics, this kind of art was intended, as you were saying about architecture in Japan, that kind of art was intended for a darker interior space. So yeah. So,
We have an audience question
Yeah.
from our Zoom audience.
We have one more here, and then
One more here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's relevant. I just saw this essay very much also as an essay that could be relevant today for climate change. And because he talks about, you know, the road through the forest and just sustainability really more than climate change. And the one other comment I had was you mentioned like the borrowed landscape, and my feeling in Japan, I am licensed with Japan and do sumi painting and things, but my thing is more about how the connectedness of the landscape more than the garden, that it's immersed in, that there's an inside outside lack of, there's a porousness to it. But also the thing that struck me the most in Japan is looking at beautiful landscapes through different shapes. Like they'd have fenestrations that, and that like I brought to my own like architecture practice and writing. Anyway, I thought that might be interesting to people. I don't know.
We have a question from Christine.
we have a response.
Oh, well, in terms of kind of the climate crisis, there's a sensitivity to kind of place, right? I think that's the dwelling in darkness, you know, means to kind of really be hyper aware of the nuances of things. And so in that regard, I think, you know, there would be some parallels to that. You know, the borrowed landscape is actually, you know, a technique in which views are framed from further on and brought back in Japanese gardens. And I think, you know, so that's a kind of a slightly different context, but thinking about, you know, where one is placed would definitely be environmentally sensitive, I think.
I don't think Tanizaki would have put it exactly this way in his day, although he died in 1965. Earth Day would come 5 days later. That one of the great losses, and now we see in the scholarship on the 250 years before the Meiji Restoration, is that Japan had an ecologically sustainable society. And actually, that's the most fascinating thing that's going on right now in Japanese studies, is looking at how the different domains work together and within the domains to not waste, to have sustainable agricultural practices. It was really, really working. And then suddenly the American ships show up in 1853, and it's all about industrialization and factories and the need for resources to keep them going. Well, what was going on for 250 years? Well, it was very much a police state, very managed society. But overall, the needs of the people were being met, and they had plenty of festival time to enjoy their lives and celebrate together as they went through the months and years. So that was a great loss from which we can still learn.
Go ahead. We have a few questions. We have a number of people.
Okay, I have two questions from the audience. One is a question for Professor Harrison. Given the great deal of scholarship on Tanizaki, and particularly in Praise of Shadows as an essay intended to be read as fiction, I'm wondering how you as a scholar of literature might think of the work's literary qualities.
The literary quality of the Praise of Shadows?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say the obvious to start with is I find it very lyrical. And I think that the whole eulogy of the shadow world is just intrinsically literary, in the sense that I think literature does belong mostly to the shadow world, insofar as it is, you know, a lot of words on a page, materially speaking, but that it's the reader who has to animate the images and animate the characters and animate the stories that take place in any book that we're reading, no? And I think in that regard, the activity of reading as well as writing literature is one in which we are trafficking in the, I don't know if I would go so far as call it the world of the dead, but something in between the world of the living and the world of the dead, no? In book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus goes to Hades to commune and hold converse with Tiresias to find out how he can get home and successfully achieve his homecoming, the shades in the underworld of Hades have to be called forth by the sacrifice of rams, and he creates, you know, a groove and a ditch where the blood flows from the rams, and this calls out the shades, and they drink of the blood, and after they've drunk of that blood, they are able to speak to him. And I've often taken that to be a kind of figure of what happens when a literary author addresses us. And they're asking of us, of our living blood, as it were, figuratively speaking, to reanimate these words, which in the absence of a live reader are just, you know, dead words on a page. And so this sort of reanimation of the eloquent image, the eidolon, the Greeks called it, you know, the psyche of the dead, I think confirms this answer that I would give, that Tanizaki's literary style, not only his literary style, but his understanding of literature is one in which it's really the shadow world, which is the proper element of the literary. And I think he has a certain kind of voice, even in English translation, that, you know, for me speaks from beyond a certain kind of threshold that I recognize as highly literary in nature. Anyone else? Yeah.
It's quite remarkable that we have this text to read. As I mentioned, he was writing this as a matter of his own pleasure that went into a collection of such essays that eventually was published in the book form. But what happened was Edward Seidensticker, not the publisher, had asked him to start publishing Japanese, translating so that they could publish Japanese literature. Why? Well, the Japanese had in the American press been so dehumanized. The war was over, and they had to be rehumanized for the American public so that they might become our allies. And so Seidensticker started with In Praise of Nettles, and then this essay was published in The Atlantic in 1955 as part of that effort to reimagine who these people on the other side of the Pacific are and what do they care about. So the history of the text, without Seidensticker, who became friends with Tanizaki, it would have just disappeared into the shadows.
I had a discussion with your architectural associate before this, before our meeting started tonight, and we were talking about my experience yesterday when I had gone to the Balins, and I was taking a photograph specifically of an egret, beautiful in color, but then looked at it in black and white. And the black and white showed things that we didn't see in color. It was almost that the color had information that wasn't as interesting or needed to be able to provide the impact. So that whole idea of the shadows and the black and white, it was just interesting because it was coincident with the reading of this book.
Yeah, that's also, that's the other thing, when they colorize old black and white movies. I mean, I'm with Woody Allen. I mean, he kind of up in arms, and you go on a crusade to stop that, because this is another form of colonization that just is, there's these small crimes against humanity. That is a small crime against humanity when you colorize a black and white original and deprive future generations of the real thing.
Well, I mean, one thing that I find so interesting as I've been thinking about this again, and maybe going into the black and white is a little of this, is that we often think of shadow as binary. Either it's in sun or it's in shadow. And I think Tanizaki did a really good job talking about the layers of shadow, right? Even when he was talking about the paper in the tokonoma in the niche, that if the paper was too new, that it would be harsh, right? That it would be glaring against the shadow, and that you needed to have a old paper to match the color of the walls. And so this idea that it's not an either or, but it's layers and layers of shadow upon themselves. And maybe in black and white, we can start to appreciate that layer in the world where in full spectrum it's hard to get there.
I appreciate your comment about how he wrote it as a brushstroke and sort of followed, because at some point you're following, where are you going with this? One thing you guys haven't mentioned or talked about at all was where he starts talking about color of people's skin, the women, like there's other things in there that, and I don't know if it's just the time or whatever else, but I was curious if anybody had anything to say about that.
I mean, it's awkwardly problematic, right? It's also 90 years ago in an imperial context, where I think he's trying to make sense of the Western world through an Eastern lens, and looking at it that way. But as this ebbs and flows, there's certain passages that I think are less significant than others. And
yes, I'm puzzled by a lot of what goes on there, in thinking about his intended audience. Does he see that this kind of talk about skin color is just irrelevant, and he's parroting something about the way he as a Japanese is being looked at by non-Japanese? I really don't know what's going on. And so I think that's a puzzle to me. It's like, who does he have in mind really when he's writing those passages?
Yeah, we were talking earlier about the chapter in Moby Dick on whiteness. There's a fascinating meditation on the ambivalence of the color white, where of course you have the white whale. And I was thinking of the same sort of ambivalence here in that passage, where here in the modern West, where among the whites that he's talking about, every chance we get, we go into the sun in order to get, bronze our skins and get it, as dark as, one can. And there on that side, according to him, it's about kind of as preserve as much whiteness as you can. So who knows? I mean, there's I agree that it's, who knows who his audience is for that. I'm not sure who his audience is. Yeah.
We have a question from Christine Bartels. She says, I'd like to hear more about Tanizaki's style in his novels as it relates to the style of his essays. Did his preference for the depth and simplicity as an aesthetic ideal, or even a lifestyle ideal, lead him into a distinctive way of writing fiction as well?
Seidensticker One of the reasons, well, first, Tanizaki writes in a very straightforward manner in his fiction, and thus Seidensticker found it quite easy and not that interesting to translate, which is why Seidensticker produced a magnificent translation of The Tale of Genji that was published in 1976, because that was a real challenge in the way that Tanizaki was not. Tanizaki was a real stylist, and he shifted around. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was reading everything, finding his own voice, and also himself produced 3 different translations of The Tale of Genji into modern Japanese. So he was always experimenting, always. But the thing is, Tanizaki knew he had an audience for his fiction, and was happy to accommodate them with clear and distinct prose for the most part.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say I've never read any of his fiction. This is really the only thing of his that I know, and that's why I'm here to learn from our panelists. Yeah.
Thank you so much for such different perspectives on the reading of this essay. It's really amazing to hear what you have to say. But I wanted to ask Meri about the silent music and what exactly you were referring to, and what is silent music in the shadows in that context of the essay or your practice.
So in the book, I believe that Tanizaki refers to the experience when it's meditative of Japanese cuisine, that it becomes almost like a form of silent music if you're able to appreciate the way the flow and the relationship of the lacquer and the gold to the miso or to the yokan. And I saw that and thought of the wasan from the Jodo Shinshu hymn, which referenced not only listening to what is normally thought of as silence, but also to this pure music, which is a metaphor for a state of being, which is like a beginner's mind and an openness. And so that's where it came from in my mind.
Doesn't he say something about music, that Japanese music is, the essence of Japanese music is in its reticence? And that therefore it cannot be performed except in the traditional context in which it originally came forth, because you have to amplify it and losing the reticence. There's a difference, I think, between reticence and silence. Nietzsche has an aphorism, if I can remember how he puts it. He says, "It is my favorite art and malice that my silence has learned not to betray itself through reticence." So that almost seems like a challenge to the art of reticence, that somehow silence can take a different form, or it can have a different palpitating core than reticence, where reticence teases you. No, it's okay, I'm not saying, but I'm hiding something, I'm kind of withholding something. It's up to you to guess what I'm withholding. Silence, I think, has a different sort of power to it when it comes to the musical.
We have a few more questions.
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
1 or 2 more.
Okay. Here's Jeff Rolifson. He says, "It seems to me that shadows seem hot and the well-lit cold, in the McLuhan sense. As parts of a scene fade into shadows, as they become the unseen, the viewer must engage and imagine to complete the scene." Comments from the panel?
I didn't quite catch. Did you catch the question? Ethen, did you? Not. Can you repeat that, please?
Okay, he says, it seems to me that shadows seem hot and the well-lit cold in the McLuhan sense. As parts of a scene fade into shadows, as they become the unseen, the viewer must engage and imagine to complete the scene. You wanted to know if the panel had some comments on that. And if not, we can go to another question.
Sounds right.
Sounds right. And he speaks about, where does he speak about the frigid?
Elegance is frigid.
What is?
Elegance.
Elegance is frigid. And I guess the person is saying that shadows are hot.
Shadows seem hot and the well-lit cold.
Yeah.
In the McLuhan sense, and I don't know the McLuhan sense. We have a question in the audience for a woman here.
Well, I just want to say about the hot and not hot and cold, but hot and cool. These are two in our, at least in our idiom, something that is cool is really not hot at all. Doesn't mean that, oh, that's really hot. Okay. It means it has an appeal in the element of hotness, but the cool, I understand, I think where the question is coming from, in the sense that the shadows are understated. They are not, they don't have that blazing kind of overwhelming quality that we associate with the hot in the idiomatic sense of the word, obviously. Whereas the cool has that sense of something under control, and it doesn't need to come forth ostentatiously into the light,
And the shadows do pull you in. When you look at those Sugimoto images of theaters, and you just have to start to look very closely to see the nuance. When you mention black and white photography, I think of Ansel Adams, who perfected, and there's black and there's white, and there are 8 shades he uses in between. And that's also one reason to really pay attention to good black and white photography, the nuance.
By the way, just for the record, Peter Sloterdijk, the German philosopher, has a book that is going to appear in English soon on gray. It's about grayness, which is, in a sense, what is between the black and the white. And it's all about shades, it's all about layering, and a great deal to do with photography, obviously, but also cinema and so much else. So I keep an eye out for Sloterdijk's book on grayness. We have time maybe for one more question if we have.
Okay, there's a question on the computer. There's a question from the audience. Okay.
Yes, I was taken by in praise of shadows and darkness with personal experience. If I can reach back into the far juvenile end of the spectrum, my 2.5-year-old granddaughter just is overjoyed when we can play hide and seek or read a book in the dark fort made out of sofa cushions. And I attribute a lot of this appeal, which Tanizaki mentions, to imagining what's there, you can't see it, and also the joy of discovery when something appears unexpectedly or new. So it occurs at a 2-year-old age or earlier.
Thanks for that remark. I look, I have no doubt that this In Praise of Shadows is a book that was deserving of another look. And I'm glad that we took another look at it. And I want to thank our panelists, Mark Gonnerman, Meri Mitsuyoshi, and Ethen Wood for their contributions. To all of you for coming, and keep an eye out for an announcement from Cynthia Haven for our next event in the fall sometime. Take care.